Welcome to another Photography Simplified video, where I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. In today's video, we're covering aperture. Just like our human eyes dilate to allow either more or less light, aperture works in a similar way. Inside of your camera's lens, there are little mechanical pieces that will either close, making a smaller hole to allow less light, or open to allow more light. Aperture is measured in what's called an f-stop, which is basically just how closed or open that hole in your lens is that allows light to hit the camera's sensor. Depending on the lens that you're using, the minimum or maximum aperture may be different, but here are some examples of some f-stops. One thing that can be confusing to a lot of beginners is that a smaller f-stop number, say f4, is really a bigger opening. There are two ways I like to think about it that really help me. One is to know that an f-stop is kind of like a fraction. The bigger the number, the smaller the size. For instance, 1/8 is going to be smaller than 1/2. That will help you too as you think about f-stops. Another way I like to picture it is that all the way open is like 0. And then as the numbers increase, it's closing tighter and tighter. So the higher the number, the tighter that aperture is going to be closed. That helps me to remember that a big number like f22 is going to be a really small opening, allowing very little light. If this video is helpful to you, please leave a like and subscribe so you can see future videos as well. I'll have more videos coming out covering other various beginner topics. Aperture is part of the exposure triangle. Aperture will control how much light we are capturing. The shutter speed is how long we capture the light, and then the ISO will be how sensitive the sensor is to the light. Aperture can be either narrow or wide. A wide aperture is going to allow more light into the image, and a narrow aperture is going to allow less light. The smaller f-stop numbers will be typically brighter photos because it's a wider aperture capturing more light, and the bigger f-stop numbers are typically darker because they're allowing less light. That's only if we're looking at aperture. Let me show you some examples using the camera of how changing only the aperture can affect the brightness in an image. Okay, I have my camera here set up looking at this potted plant in manual mode. I'm in manual mode because I want to be able to control all of my camera settings. With the lens I have right now, the widest I can open my aperture is f4. You can see that I've set the camera settings so that at f4, I'm getting a pretty good brightness as far as this photo of the plant goes. And what you'll notice is as I make that aperture more narrow, closing it up, allowing less light, the photo is going to get darker and darker. At the maximum aperture of f25, you can see that it's very dark. Please note that changing your other camera settings can affect the brightness of your image as well, so you can still get bright photos at f22 or f16. If you want to learn more about those other topics, check out my other videos or consider looking at my book, Photography Simplified.
If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
Aperture is also going to affect your depth of field. Depth of field is basically how much of your image is in focus. You could have a shallow depth of field, meaning not very much is in focus, maybe just your subject and everything else is kind of blurry like the background. Or you could have a wide depth of field, where most, if not all of the image is in focus, everything from the foreground to the background. A small f-stop number, like f4, is going to have a very shallow depth of field. A large f-stop number, like f16, is going to have a large depth of field, where a lot of the image is in focus. Let's look at an example of how changing just the aperture can affect the depth of field of a scene. For this example, I'm going to be shooting in what's called Aperture Priority Mode, which is a camera mode that lets me choose the aperture and the camera chooses the rest of the settings, which will help me to focus on just changing that depth of field. To help explain how aperture affects depth of field, I've got this set up with my camera pointed at this jar of mayo, which is going to be my focusing point. Then further back, we have some mustard, and then even further back, some ketchup. And this will help to illustrate how when we change our aperture, the depth of field changes. We're going to be shooting in aperture priority mode, so that way we can focus on changing the aperture without having to worry about the other camera settings. As I mentioned, we're focused on that first jar of mayo. Currently, my f-stop is at 4.5, which is the widest I can have it right now with the lens that I'm using. Focusing on that mayo, let's take a shot with that wide aperture. You can see that the mayo is in focus. However, the mustard and the ketchup are not. They're out of the depth of field. Because we're using such a wide aperture, we have a very shallow depth of field. Now let's try something more in the middle. I'm going to set the f-stop to f13 in this case. This will give us a wider depth of field, hopefully to include the mustard as well. Let's take that picture. We can see that in this picture, the mayo is still in focus, but now we're able to read the mustard, and the mustard is in focus as well. We've achieved that wider depth of field using a narrower aperture. Now I'm going to use a very narrow aperture, f22, to get the ketchup in focus as well. And this will give us an even wider depth of field. Let's take that picture. Now we can see that in this picture, the mayo, the mustard, and all the way back to the ketchup is in focus as well. Our narrow aperture of f22 has allowed us to have a wider depth of field, including all three of the objects. You might be wondering, when do I want a shallow or a wide depth of field? It'll partly come down to your own personal preference, but instances when you may want a shallow depth of field are things like portraits. If you really want your subject to stand out, you want the background to be blurry, making it easier to pay attention to the subject or the person you're photographing. That's when it might be a good idea to use a shallow depth of field. You will probably want a large depth of field for things like landscape photography, when you want the whole scene you're capturing to be in focus. I really hope that this video has helped you. If it has, please leave a comment below and check out my future videos. Next week, we'll cover shutter speed.